Well,
good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is part of our Citizen Science series. Every first Thursday of the month we have something scientific to share with the community. We try to get local speakers and local interest as much as possible. This is a little bit further afield, but we do have a local speaker. It's actually from 45 years ago that Ian Walton went on his trip to Greenland. He's going to share us the pictures from that and also his thoughts on how things are changing now with our global warming. He's done a lot of work on getting the pictures off the old cellophane, which you remember from those days, and putting them on the computer. So I'm sure you'd appreciate that as you see the pictures coming up. And then our next one, I just want to advertise while I've got you all here, is the next one next month is called Yard Map. And we have a group here in Santa Cruz County who are trying to link up everybody's yard. So we have a wildlife corridor around the coast. So if you're interested in getting your yard on the map, come along next month and you'll find out how to do that. We have a specialist who's trained, she's actually with the Cornell, the extension, so that Cornell does throughout the whole nation in tracking birds and other wildlife. So please come along, it'll be at the downtown library. Look forward to seeing you there. So, Ian, it's all yours.
Thank you. Hello, I'm so glad you made it. We were worried that no one would show up because we had forgotten it was Cinco de Mayo. So welcome. So it depends how far back you go, whether you count me as a local speaker. I grew up in Scotland, and this story starts there. And then I came to UC Santa Cruz in 1973. And Linda was my boss for several years.
Only in some ways.
So this is the 45th anniversary of this story. It starts at the University of St. Andrews. I used to joke to irritate the UCSC people that they were the second most beautiful coastal university in the world because St. Andrews was the first. So this is the town of St. Andrews in the old cathedral. You may have heard of it for one of two reasons, neither of which would be the university, that's right. One, it might be because you play golf. The other one, it might be because you noticed that many years later it was where William and Kate met as students. They were both undergraduates at St. Andrews. So what we're going to be looking at is pictures from this 1971 expedition. The university had a long series of these expeditions where they took undergraduates to Greenland. They thought they were scientific expeditions. However, all the members of the expeditions, they were from many disciplines, and we did some science while we were there, but the common factor was we were all mountaineers. We were all members of the very active University Mountaineering Club. So in a sense, this was the long-standing British tradition of climbing expeditions that also explored mountainous regions of the world and did science while they were there. So, turned out I was added late to this expedition, so this phase happened before I joined. Getting supplies to Greenland in 1970 was not easy. So they were loaded in these typically British tea chests and sent off on a ship to Denmark. And then, why Denmark, I hear you cry? Because, yes, at that time, well, Greenland was originally a colony of Denmark. At this time, its status was sort of unresolved. It's now got home rule as an independent country within the larger Denmark. It's a most peculiar constitutional situation. So anyway, we had to load these many months ahead, send them to Copenhagen in the hopes that they would make it onto a ship headed for Greenland and arrive about the same time we would. Some of you may have seen pictures like that. If you ever take a non-stop from Europe back to the west coast and it follows the Great Circle route, I promised this would be a science talk, right? So Great Circle route is the thing on the map that looks way longer, but in fact it's shorter because the Earth is curved. Okay. That's the math part at the top. But especially when you're coming westbound, they go further north because of the winds, and you'll often cross over the southern tip of Greenland. And if you're lucky, you'll see sites like this. One flight I had in the last 40 years went right over the southern tip on a clear day, and I was actually able to see some of the mountains that we climbed. It was a lot of fun.
Irritate people when they have the window because they're watching a movie. It's like, no,
Yes, they're trying to sleep. Or, yes. And I remember one where I said something to a stewardess about that must be an iceberg down there, and she said, "Oh no, could it possibly be?" You know. So to get to Greenland, for the people involved, we flew from Scotland to Iceland, to Reykjavik, and of course it was a next day connection and we didn't have any money. So we took our sleeping bags and we trotted out to the end of the runway at Keflavik and set up camp. Now imagine trying to do that today, especially since Keflavik is a US military base as well as being their international airport. So in the morning we were sort of waking up when this Jeep comes rolling up and these two large burly guys get out, and I can't imitate the Texas accent, but they said, "You can't sleep here." And then they said, "Well, we don't see why the hell not." And they took off again. So, then you get an Icelandair jet to the west coast of Greenland. This is us on the runway at airstrip called Narsarsuaq, which is a most peculiar place. It's this giant runway in the middle of nowhere. And if you look it up online, I mean, we heard various stories while we were there, the most interesting of which was this was a base where they sent the lunatic American pilots who had cracked up during the war, and they thought they were in an operational base, but they weren't. When I looked it up online recently, it said this was one of the transit points for shipping aircraft and supplies to Europe during World War II. But it also said, curiously, that it had a large military hospital. So I don't know, perhaps both of the stories were in fact true. So this was us on the runway at Narsarsuaq. And from there we took a little coastal ship to go further south down the west coast. This is one of the archaeology parts at the top. The settlement in the background there is Brattahlid. It was the settlement of Eric the Red, the Viking who, quote, first colonized Greenland because he was expelled from Iceland as a troublemaker. And he named Greenland Greenland because he thought it would attract other people to come and join him. There is, in fact, precious little green in Greenland. Over 90% of it, as you know, is the central ice cap. But anyway, that was his original settlement there as we went down the fjord. So the area that we're talking about, southern tip of Greenland, Cape Farewell right at the bottom. The airstrip that we landed at was off the picture to the top. And we got this coastal ship down, and we spent 3 weeks in a little village on this island here. Not by design, you'll hear why in a moment. And then the climbing area was this box, and that's the blow up with some of our camps and some of the peaks that we climbed. We climbed 34 major peaks while we were there, 10 of us. 30 of them were, as far as we know, were first ascents.
Wow. And how high were they?
Not that high in comparison to the Sierra or the Alps.
Right.
Most of the ones we did were 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet. But we were doing them from sea level.
Right.
And
What
we'll get
season of
lots of
year?
conversations about the weather. The biggest challenge was the weather.
What season of year?
This was July and August, so we were there for 10 weeks altogether. The previous St. Andrews expeditions had always gone further north, and in normal climate times, and I don't actually know if it's still true. So the normal summer weather pattern in the summer was you got fairly good weather in Europe, and then you got a permanent high pressure over the Arctic that caused beautiful weather in the north of Greenland, and then you had this constant procession of depressions going across the south of Greenland where we were. We were warned that the only other place on Earth with weather like this was Patagonia. The mountains were somewhat similar. That's our trusty leader. He was a physics professor. I have various props that I brought with me. You'll notice that on a lot of the pictures, Phil has kindly raised his. But the heads look incredibly fuzzy because we're all wearing these things all of the time. They don't make mosquito nets in Scotland. This is a Woolworths mesh shopping bag. It's very effective. So Phil was a physics professor. He led many of these expeditions. 2 years ago on the Queen's Honor List, he received the Polar Medal. Which is given to Arctic and Antarctic explorers who further science and education, and so good for Phil. Heading south on this little coastal boat, we began to run into ice. The ice flow pattern around Greenland goes, the biggest amount of ice is on the east coast in the winter. But in the summer, it gets swept southwards and around Cape Farewell, and it all piles up against the coast right here. But small ships like ours were able to sort of thread in between it, so that's what we were trying to do. This was a 2-day journey. They wouldn't let us stay on the ship overnight. So this was the largest city in southern Greenland. It was then called Julianahope, the Danish name. It's now called Qaqortoq. Many of the cities in Greenland have 2 names, a Danish one and a Greenlandic one. So we pitched our tents in the main square.
Oh,
It's not actually going to show up in the Algo Point. Do you see them there? And if memory serves me correctly, we cooked and washed our utensils in the decorated fountain. Nobody came and arrested us. Heading further south the next day, we're beginning to get into the mountainous scenery near the south tip. This is an island off the southwest coast. Interestingly, my wife Susan and I are going back this summer to do a coastal trip. Greenland has a state ferry service, rather like the Alaska State Ferry Service, that mixes locals and tourists, and you can put together your own sort of little mini cruise. So we're going down the west coast, and at the very southern end we'll overlap. We in fact will fly back from this strange airstrip at Nersaswak, we hope. So here we are hanging out in the Nanortalik, the little township on the island that I showed you. This is the hospital. 2 of the nurses, I noticed one of them smoking.
right.
Many of the local children, whoever plus we went in Nanortalik, there were 20 children chasing after us. We had not intended to be here very long, but you remember the ship,
Yes.
and you remember the ice coming around the corner.
Yes.
Well, turns out the ship that our supplies were on got stuck in the ice in about March and went back to Denmark. So we arrived in June in Nanortalik, and none of our supplies were here. No tents, no food, no climbing equipment, no money. And even better, the local Danish authorities had not received a letter saying that we were coming. So we got off this ship and they said, "Who are you?" So we had a wonderful time for 3 weeks experiencing this very small island. From the township, you could see 3 sort of little rounded hills. We named them Hills 1, 2, and 3. And when we got really bored and explored some more, we had Hill 1.5 and Hill 1.95. And you could tell there was a heavy representation of mathematicians in this. But it turned out even this small island, this was what happened if you went over the back of these small hills down to the coastline. They had these amazing 1,000-foot cliffs down to the ocean. It was quite difficult to circumnavigate the island. So no food, no money, no accommodations. The local doctor provided us with a wrecked house that he owned and said, you can just move in. So we did that. And we ate at the workers' cafeteria. But this was what we had to do to try and make enough money to pay for the meals at the cafeteria. We had 2 jobs that we rotated amongst the 10 of us, mixing concrete on this work site. But we figured we were worth our weight in gold. We did help them repair the concrete mixer one day when nobody there apparently knew how to fix it. Neither did we, but being university-trained students, we could figure out what was wrong and what to do to fix it.
Did they bring the cement in from other places, or did they have a cement plant there?
No, they didn't. I'm guessing they must have brought the cement on the summer supply ships and then used local rock to add to the concrete. There wasn't a cement plant.
Yeah, you can do it, but it's pretty
Yeah.
tedious. You have to have fuel. Doesn't look like there's a lot of fuel.
So while we were there, it was an anniversary, but you know, I forgot to say something about St. Andrews in that opening slide, especially since Linda is here. While UCSC was celebrating its 50th anniversary last year, St. Andrews was busy celebrating its 800th anniversary as a university, just to give you the scope of things. So here we were celebrating a 250th anniversary of the arrival of a Lutheran
Then they died.
though. Yes.
So is the Greenland language Inuit, or what is it?
It's one of the many variants of Inuit languages. I don't actually know exactly which one, and partly I'm saying that because I've also been to Ellesmere Island, where they have a peculiar, and they have 2 different written versions of the same spoken language. So yes, in this village there would be 3 languages spoken. There would be their version of Inuit, and then the administrators all spoke Danish, and most of them also spoke English.
Wow.
So we got bored after a while. This is my climbing partner, Andrew. We hitched a ride on a speedboat across to the mainland. And the guy dropped us off and he said, all right, I'll be back in 24 hours, make sure you're here. So we climbed our hill in the evening and we spent the night on top. This is the moon coming up over the sea fog. Now at that time, we weren't familiar with this sea fog comes in several thousand feet like we have often in Santa Cruz. So that was us looking out over some of the coastal mountains. And then we spent the night on the top, and then we went back and slept in the morning sun until the speedboat arrived. That's what we were all waiting for. Somewhat strangely named Britannia. And we thought, great, we'll get underway. But there were 2 hitches. One was because our freight had been there for so long, it was on the very bottom of the last hold. And then just before we were about to leave, the local police got a cable from the Gothook police saying, we're not sure if you have enough insurance, please fix it. So, you know, no telephones, no internet, no Skype. There were all these cables going back and forward from Nanortalik to Denmark to St. Andrews trying to fix this. Partly it was about the ability to self-rescue, because there had been expeditions that had needed rescue. So and you'll hear this in the climbing story, we intended that anything we did, if we got into trouble, we were going to rescue ourselves. So eventually we all left Nanortalik. Here we are up the fjord to the south, unloading from the little fishing boat. Remember the tea chests? So this was when it sort of suddenly sunk in. Here we were, 10 of us abandoned on this beach with 2 tons of tea chests. And the only way to move stuff around was for us to carry them. Wow. And there was this strange fence. We were never sure if we were inside or outside. You were asking about greenery, you're beginning to see now in the color slides that sort of the lowest 1,000 feet was vegetation. Most of Greenland, that's not true.
Are there any trees?
Not where I was. We split into separate parties. There were rumored to be small trees up one of the other valleys which escaped the last ice age, and therefore was an interesting botanical place. One of the things in the report that I have with me is just a botanical survey that records like 98 different species, which you wouldn't necessarily expect here. So that was our idyllic base camp. Although the tents were far from idyllic. These are two-man mountain tents called Arctic Guineas that we took with us when we were climbing. This was an ancient thing called a storm haven. The storm was the last thing it could cope with. They were all canvas, they were heavy. They weren't very weatherproof, but that's what we had. But it was a beautiful spot. That's the fjord that we had come up on the fishing boat from. That was the mountain right above our base camp, which we named the Buchel. If any of you have been to the Scottish Highlands, the Buchel is the mountain at the entrance to Glencoe. A very distinctive mountain, and this looked just like it. And there we were trying to. So notice the primitive pack frame. It's just a slab of wood. The supplies all came in these rectangular cardboard boxes, chosen because 8 of them would fit in a tea chest. But remember the constitutional conversation we had a little while back. The beer necessary to the expedition had to come from Denmark. Otherwise, we would have had to pay alcohol tax on shipping it from Scotland to Denmark to Greenland, so our beer supplies were too large, except for the carefully smuggled. Are any of you Scotch enthusiasts? Glenfiddich.
He's wearing a mosquito covering for his head? Is that what that is?
Yes. So that's a red version of my big Woolworths. The mosquito shopping bags came in a variety of colors. And yeah, we wore them almost all the time. Mosquitoes, black fly, what you'd find in Arctic Canada or Alaska.
What did the people who live there, what did they do?
I don't know. I mean, in a lot of, I've been a Sierra Club leader in Alaska, and I mean, you notice that the people that Alaska and Canadian Arctic. That is Andrew not posing, he's just walking through it, trying to find a way through. So everywhere place we went, the first 1,000 feet we had to cope with making our way through this stuff.
Were any of them poisonous, like poison oak or?
No, fortunately. All the way at the top, the fjord, base camp on the little narrow strip, lake that we padded the supplies up, interim camp on here. We didn't have good maps in those days. So a lot of this was, well, two things you'll see play out. We didn't have good maps, and we weren't Yosemite wall climbers. We were good mixed rock and ice, but so a lot of what we ended up doing without the maps was, could we explore enough to find a route that was within our capabilities and that we felt was safe given this self-insurance imposition. So this was us on our first day at the head of the lake, just climbing something nearby to get a view of the surrounding land. So most of our routes were done by visual route finding. That's a modern map downloaded off the internet a month or so ago by somebody who did a trek in this same area. So they had a boat and they came down the fjord and then they trekked through the valley to the next fjord. So the peaks that we were climbing in these 10 weeks were these ones there and these ones there. And the strange valley that might or might not have had a tree in it, Hengadalen, that's the one that supposedly escaped the Ice Age and had interesting flora. I was not on the party that spent 3 weeks up there. So once we got enough supplies ferried to the head of the lake, we split into 2 climbing groups, a group of 6 and a group of 4. And the group I was with carried our supplies all the way up here to, let's see, about there, just about the pass, and set up a camp.
What kind of animal life is there? Do you have anything that would eat your food, like raccoons or maybe bears?
There didn't seem to be, there certainly weren't any bears. There didn't even seem to be the small raccoons, squirrels, marmots that you have to fight with in the Sierra. So that was not something we had trouble with. Maybe because the weather in the winter is really grim.
Is there any goats or anything?
Not wild ones. The farm folks that came in for the summer probably had goats with them. But really, no, I'm not sure that I remember a mammal at all. There were occasional birds of prey.
Because the northern Canadian islands have polar bears.
Yes, that's true. Yes, my Ellesmere trip, we worried about that a lot.
Did you say anything earlier when the Vikings came there? Were there already peoples there? Were there native people there at that time?
I don't have the definitive answer for that. Most of the earlier histories say no, the Vikings were the discoverers. Most of the later histories seem to say yes, of course there were Inuit people in the same way that there were all across the Arctic.
Yes. I mean, you think that they would have in their writings or whatever they had, some, whatever interactions they would have had.
Storytelling.
You would.
We're in a museum in Copenhagen, and they did have a discussion of the natives and the people that settled, and there was conflict.
And I think the southwest coast where was and still is the greenest part, and that's where the Vikings went. I would guess the native Greenlanders were further north, as they still are.
That seems to be what we read.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't remember at all.
And the birds, were they seagulls or were they hawks or?
There were gulls, there were occasional hawks. I mean, there really weren't very many.
Butterflies?
I don't remember any butterflies.
Mosquitoes.
Mosquito, lots of mosquitoes, lots of black fly.
What do these mosquitoes eat?
Blood. There's not very many mammals for them to eat. you know.
So this was the view out of my tent at this first climbing camp. And it illustrates some of the difficulties. If you're a mountaineer in Scotland, you tend to find a nice ridge and you start and you go gently all the way up the ridge to the summit. And we thought, great, we'll do that here. So I think the first climb that we attempted, we went up there and we went up this nice ridge. We got to about there. And one of the recurring themes was these ridges have these enormous unexpected clefts. You can almost see, if you're looking for it, that there might be one there. We called them schnicks, which seemed an appropriate name, but actually it was the name of the glacier Santa Cruz we were using. So our first attempt, we got up there and failed and had to turn around and come back to the camp. So the second attempt, we said, right, we're going for something easier. These were 3 hills down towards the fjords to the east. And the 6 of us, in fact, split into 3 groups of 2 and did each one of those. Andrew and I did this one at the end. Looks sort of fairly rounded. The route went up here, out across there to the ridge and up like that. You can't really see the difficult bit. What's in here was a glacier. So it was difficult climbing the glacier snout at the bottom. It was incredibly difficult getting from there to there.
So what did you have on your feet? Crampons?
Crampons, yes. Well, and I also had, I brought some show and tell that you're welcome to come look at the end.
Yeah, ice hats.
This is a specialized ice climbing hammer. It's actually American. It's made by Chenard. And then, for safety purposes, we had something that I'm not sure I've ever seen in climbing circles here. Anybody know what this is? This has the delightful name, a dead man. So it's used if you're trying to belay and anchor yourself in soft snow. That you dig this plate in perpendicular to where you estimate you're going to fall, and the cable comes out along the line of your rope in any possible fall. And so if you pull on this, it has to move this enormous mass of snow. It's a very safe anchor as long as the entire mass of snow doesn't, doesn't avalanche, right? So one of the hazards was these mountains, although they weren't terribly large, they were larger than we could comfortably do most days. So we kept finding ourselves benighted, in part because being university students, we didn't like getting up early in the morning. And we tried to change that, we tried to fix that by adjusting our local clock by 4 hours to what we call Wild Mountain Time. If you're a Scottish folk singer, you'll get the reference. But it didn't really work because, of course, the argument went, Wild Mountain Time is 8 in the morning, we should get up, but we know it's really 4 in the morning, so we won't get up until noon. Anyway, this was us on the mountain that night. We might have gone off and made it home, except that on the way down I dropped a crampon, which was what we were using, and I needed it, so we had to sleep out overnight and go back up the next morning and find the crampon. So one of the other things I brought for show and tell, we had these strange wooden backpacks, but most of our carrying was done in this thing. It's called a Taiso sack. After the Taiso, after the leading purveyor of mountaineering equipment in Edinburgh. And it's just a large canvas sack with 2 straps.
Right. Wow.
But one of the advantages of it was this pulls out, you open it up, and you clamber in and you spend the night. It's like a portable bivy sack that you carry the rest of your stuff in. So that was a good in here. It's probably from California.
So what?
Oh, and that's where the crampons were tied on.
Uh-huh.
Mine fell off.
Right.
What time of the year was this?
July and August.
So you're getting really late evenings as
Long
well, right,
days.
with the sun?
Yes, although they weren't terribly long. The south of Greenland is about the same latitude as middle Canada, perhaps. So it was south of the Arctic Circle. We didn't get the tremendously long light that
Well, not like.
some of the expeditions that had gone further north into the good weather got.
But maybe like 10 p.m. or something, like Portland, Oregon gets there in that time of year, it's getting really late.
I did a climb in Jasper, I think it was, and I got back to my car about 11 o'clock, having just about 15 minutes of remaining daylight.
That might have thrown off your time thing too, I think.
Really, the time was hopeless because we never knew how long a climb would take, and we just climbed until it was done, and then we ate when we got back. And yeah, it was the real time, either in Greenlandic time or in our wild mountain time, sort of became irrelevant. It was more, it turned out, determined by the weather, because shortly after this, the weather began to deteriorate. But this was the second mountain that we climbed. This thing, called Splendisk. We, of course, got to name all the mountains, but they don't appear on the Greenlandic maps, because their surveyors, when they get to them, choose local names or make up local names. I was intrigued, though, on that current map that I showed you, several of the altitude points were, in fact, mountains that we'd climbed.
Oh.
So I don't know if that was why. So we climbed that, but we came up from the back. Obviously, doing the Yosemite Giant Wall was not within our capabilities, so we were route finding for something better on the backside. I mentioned the difficulty of getting off the glacier. If you have done snow and ice climbing, or if you've been to the Alps, you'll know about bergschrunds. They're where the snow separates from the mountain rock and often leaves this gap that's difficult to get across. So that's Richard negotiating the bergschrund. And this was the most peculiar mountain. We came up this glacier and off it to a ridge and then descended a rock wall onto a second glacier. But it all worked really well. It was a beautiful day. So that's sort of typical. That's looking south towards Cape Farewell, Prince Christian Sund, which is the fjord that cuts right across the south of Greenland.
How did you get your water supplies for drinking water?
Every place we camped, there were streams. I mean, actually, there was lots of water.
So did you have to boil it, or did you have tablets, or you just drank it?
We just drank it in
Okay.
those days, interestingly.
Yeah.
And we did have some bouts of intestinal distress, but I'm not sure it was from the water.
Right, right, okay.
Did you go to specifically for the peaks that you climbed? Did you knew they were there, or you just kind of showed up?
No, we didn't know they were there ahead of time because we didn't have good maps or photographs or climbing guides or it. So the exploration part was look and see what peak is there, and then see if you can find a route that's in your capabilities. Get up it.
There wasn't the specific peaks that you were going to ascend.
I mean, we knew there were beautiful rock peaks in this area. There was only one specific one that we knew about that I'll show you later on. And while we were on the top on a good day like that, we tried to do a lot of the planning for what comes next. So this was a mountain that we called Anvil, because on the very top, and you'll get a close-up later, there was this huge balanced block that looked like a blacksmith's anvil to us. However, our attempt on that mountain failed because of another schnick. So we were coming up the ridge line on the right there. Now, it doesn't look that hard, But, you know, so the problem is it's 30, 40 feet of round, smooth, slippery, hopeless granite. So we looked at that and we thought, we might be able to get out there and get back there. And then we decided, nah, if we fall off here, we're in big trouble. And the reason for that was if you were where Andrew is standing and you looked either to your left or to your right, that's what you saw. So if you came off that nice rounded boulder, you were going to land several thousand feet below on the glacier.
You notice you're wearing helmets.
Yes, we did all wear helmets all the time, but mainly for rock fall rather than for people fall. So this is back to the top of Splendis that we were sitting on, taking all these pictures and planning further routes. These are 2 peaks that we did in the second half of the expedition. This one had this amazingly intricate crevasse system all the way up there. And then this one we did as an afterthought in the middle of the night. You'll hear why when we get there. So we thought this was a great day. Everything was going smoothly. We were having a good time. And we set off back down, anticipating dinner.
That's below you.
That's looking straight down between my legs.
Oh,
And that's all I could see. I mean, I couldn't see anything that I could identify as the bottom. And wanting to fulfill my duties as expedition photographer, I did also take a black and white, but we'll skip it. This is what it looked like when I finally resurfaced.
Wow.
So notice the surface looks entirely flat and smooth, not a trace. I mean, you know, when you're walking down the glacier, you look out for depressions, and we were pretty good at it. But in this case, not a trace.
So how does this affect your further trekking?
Well, that from then on, they always made me lead on the snow, including immediately after this, which was probably a good thing. All the ropes, what the others eventually did was the friction was so great, they couldn't haul me up even when they had the three of them on the surface.
Wow.
So they kept the rope that I'd been climbing on as a safety, and they lowered 2 more ropes with loops. So then I would stand in one loop while they pulled the other one to here, and then I would climb into the other one, and they would pull up the first one. So a quite effective technique.
Could you talk to each other?
No. So so yes, it was scary when I was down there, when for all I knew, all 4 people had fallen in.
How far down were you, would you say?
I would say I was about 15 feet
Yeah.
down, so it was quite a lot of work.
Right.
I mean, there's no way I could have climbed out on my own, because the walls were really hard glacier ice. So that was my most exciting moment in grief. But it got me a lot of good press. For example, Scotland's daily newspaper, The Scotsman, there was the picture of the crevasse. It's great.
So while you were there, it appears that no one else besides your party was doing this sort of work. If you went there now, would there be all kinds of people climbing about and doing things, or?
I don't know if there's people climbing. I know there's people trekking in the valleys, like from that modern map that I showed you.
Yeah.
I know some St. Andrews expeditions have been back to this same area climbing different peaks. I'm imagining that if you're climbing, you still need to get a permit from and insurance from the Greenland/Danish government. So that's sort of what we took in our pack in terms of day equipment, climbing equipment.
It's like a modern road.
Fairly, yes, it was a caramantal rope, which is probably good. If it had been an old style rope and I had landed on it around my waist, I wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
So once we'd recovered from that, we thought this was the next thing to try. We called this mountain Teepee. You can sort of see why. So up the ice fall, getting closer. The route we eventually took went up between this pinnacle and the center pinnacle.
Oh, that's on somebody's.
It's very steep.
That's the first pit. This was probably the hardest thing that Mike would climb. That's Mike on the first pitch.
Looks slippery.
That's the other hoax.
Oh.
That's the Isle of Skye in Scotland, the premier summer rock climbing area in Skye, for those of you who've been there. Very similar, though, granite. The only clue might be, yes, if you were looking at the rope, that ain't the same rope. Very similar terrain.
This is a more recent photograph, looks like, in the last 10 or 20 years?
No, actually, that's probably from the 70s when I was climbing from St. Andrews. And actually, one of those 2 people is the same climbing partner as in the Greenland ones.
Wow.
That was the summit tower of the 3rd pinnacle, not the one we were trying to climb. We looked at that one and sort of shuddered and thought, that's hopeless, we can't do that.
It's good to know your limitations.
Is that a
But
person in the middle?
Is that a person in the middle?
No. Because in fact, this whole shot is a zoom on the neighboring pinnacle with a huge gap between the pinnacle we're on and that one. But you'll notice it's getting dark.
Yeah.
And if you look really closely, you'll notice the next storm system's coming in. So we settled down on our ledge in our comfy bivy sacks. The first couple of hours were fine. About 2 in the morning it started pouring. So we went from, the logbooks record, somebody asked me about water, so water in the camps was no problem.
Right.
Something like this, we had to carry it. In this case, for the first couple of hours, we were melting snow over a candle in a little tin, probably a jam jar lid. And then 2 hours later, it was pouring. This is what it looked like on the way down.
Wow.
This is the physics part of the lesson. So when you're climbing down a mountain, so we climbed down to there. We weren't going to climb down this overhanging bit. We were going to abseil. So you're sort of standing on the edge thinking, I have to maneuver myself off over this edge and I'll be close to the rock. And I'm not worried about this giant waterfall that's 3 or 4 feet out. What happens as soon as you step off the edge?
You swing.
Right. Right into the same path as the waterfall. So we had to abseil down, I don't know, 50
What does
feet.
that sound mean?
Repel.
Repel?
Rappel, yes. Abseil is the German version
Okay.
of the French rappel.
Okay,
So
got it.
both mean slide down the rope in
Right.
a more or less controlled fashion. And again, actually, the technology, we did not have the metal rappel loops, so we were doing this the traditional wound over our shoulder.
Wow. Did you have carabiners?
We did have carabiners, yes, and pegs and ice screws. So this was very wet. That was the next day, trying to dry everything out, yes.
Wow.
Looked like a Scottish backyard laundry room.
And what was in those sleeping bags? Were they down? Oh.
As were these various beautiful down jackets. Yeah, so fiberfill hadn't
Come around.
arrived on the scene at that
Right.
point. If we'd known how wet it was going to be, we might not have taken down. In the previous expeditions further north, they really needed the down.
Right.
But we had much wetter. I mean, the weather we had was much closer to Scotland than the previous teams had encountered.
Did you
It's
get-
not that we weren't used to dealing with the Windows Oddity, this slideshow.
Did you get
randomly-
enough sun to dry those down jackets?
We did have, yeah,
You got enough?
so at this point, we were still getting enough sun to dry things out. This is back at the base camp covering kitchen cabinets and the tea chests. This was the expedition mascot owl carved out of a breeze block in the Northlick while we were hanging out those 3 weeks. Paraffin stoves, jet fuel, so not Coleman fuel. Culture. This was an interesting mountain called Church Spire across the field. One of our parties went and looked at it, but that was as far as they got.
They're formidable, some of them.
So then after recuperating, we reorganized into 2 different subgroups and headed off to 2 more camps. That's Andrew sneaking a snack when he thinks no one's looking.
Are the rocks on the edge of the tent a wind barrier? What's going on with that?
It's funny you should ask that, yes. So normally we didn't bother with anything like wind barriers. I think we must have had an inkling of what was coming. So the fly sheets on these tents do not reach the ground, which in gentle rain is a good thing. It helps with the condensation buildup. But in what we were about to get, it was a nightmare because the wind, we called this hurricane camp. The wind blew down off the glacier under the exposed bed of fly sheet and just lifted them right off. And so we built lots of tent walls, saved the tent walls, we called them. So the weather really deteriorated in this second half, but we snatched a couple of good days. One of them went up this, remember the Anvil peak with the big block? This was the snow gully to the left of it. That was a good crevasse picture. Being true Brits, we describe it as you could put a London bus in there with no trouble at all, double-decker. That's coming out the top side of the bergschrund. I put that one in, so the helmets, that's avalanche rockfall. So we, you know, these mountains were very loose geologically, like some of the Sierra. So that was our main concern in the helmets.
Are helmets normally bright colored so they can be spotted, or that's irrelevant?
I assume that's why they did it. I don't.
Are they all-
The only ones that I remember, well, actually, somebody had a white one, but most of them were red or orange. I certainly subscribe to that theory. My skiing helmet when Susan and I ski is fluorescent pink, because I would like somebody to find me if I hit a tree.
Right.
So this was a very interesting peak. The summit was not just snow, it was a glacier. So you snout all the crevasses, so the entire summit was ice. Wasn't that hard once we got up there. We were getting good at negotiating crevasses by this time. If you were here early, you saw some of the black and white version of these pictures. So that's a close-up of the Anvil Peak, and you can see the block balanced on the top. That's what it looked like in color. How you build a cairn, I hear you cry. We actually carried rocks up in our packs. I kid you not. So the tradition was on every summit we built a cairn and we left a message in a jam jar or a can for future. That's sort of a climbing tradition when you do first ascents. One of our peaks, we found such a note from a previous expedition. That was the peak above Hurricane Camp when we saw it. We very rarely saw it. I've been trying to analyze on Google Earth and current maps what on earth it is, and I can't figure it out. I think it's one of these things that looked enormous from below, but is just the end of a ridge. So I've failed in tracking it down so far. We called it Big Fred. So the peak that I showed you earlier with the very complicated crevasse and glacier system, this is us attacking it. And what's unusual about this, so the main glacier is down here and the crevasses. Usually when you're climbing in crampons, you're going up or down. In this case, we were doing this really nasty, they're traversing towards me to sort of get around the end of the crevasse.
Barehanded.
Barehanded, must have been a warm day for Southern Greenland.
The snow's cold.
I had actually was using the fact that you get extra grip by having your hand stick to the ice. That's the summit. So the glacier ice wall that you just looked at was down below here, so we had sort of come up like that and back. And that's getting near the summit. And that's it in color. Beautiful peak. So this was the one where we found the previous note. We called it French Top because we think it was climbed by a French expedition in 1957.
So that note was there a long time.
Yes. That's the view from the top of that one again to the south with the fjords.
Did you add a note, or did you just say, oh, it's French?
I'm guessing we would add a note saying we were here too. I believe we left the original.
I would hope so.
So as you can see, this is a little shaky, but on the way down from French Top, the weather had deteriorated now that we were getting sort of 18-hour windows maybe when it wasn't pouring. So we had changed to climbing whatever we could when it was dry. So in this case, we were halfway down off French Top, and 3 of the 4 of us said, looks like it's still dry, want to climb something else during the night. So we climbed up this valley in the dark, and this was the site as we came to the ridge and popped our heads over the top. We were looking south, and that's the moon reflected in Prince Christiansen. And as you can see, I was cold and the camera was shaking, but it was still cold. And most of the remaining 5 days, that's what it looked like.
Wow.
out the tent door. Terrible weather.
Was it raining and snowing, or was it just cold, or was it
Where
windy?
we were camped, it was still rain. The other subgroup were camped slightly higher, and they had snow, and one of their tents collapsed. But as you can see, the snow is right down on anything. So this
Right.
sort of put paid to serious climbing because
Right.
everything was covered with soft, loose, wet snow. That's the picture that was on the flyer. If you saw it, that's us evacuating while it's still pouring.
What did you do with all your gear? Did you pack it out?
Still fits.
It's a little faded, but so this was the latest in high-tech rain gear from the same supplier in Edinburgh. Very heavy nylon, neoprene coated, guaranteed 100% waterproof. But that's me. You can tell I'm having a good time. So yes, me and the Tyso sack.
You look tired.
They hadn't figured out in the technology of waterproofing nylon at that point that they needed to do something special about the seams. So, yeah, it leaked like a sieve along that,
Oh, great.
that hood seam. So we met up with a very bedraggled crew, all of us down at the head of the rock there. But then it developed into a few days of this sort of beautiful Indian summer. That's looking up Kingadalan, which is the valley with the large number of plants that skip the ice age. So one of our groups spent 2 weeks up there.
Just one? Oh,
Yes.
one
Yes.
group, not one person.
Right, so when I was on that first half,
Right.
the other
Right.
subgroup was up there.
Right.
On the second half, the other subgroup was up close to here because they wanted to try this peak.
Looks like the Matterhorn.
And they called it the Fang. Turned out it wasn't as hard as it looked. But they were camped above the snow line, so they had a lot of trouble with the same storm as we had.
Is that loose rock on the snow?
Yes. Yeah, so all of that stuff is loose rock. I gathered the route they found on this, which was around the back, it was actually pretty good rock. So what we were doing at this point, from the head of the lake to get back to base camp, you either needed to use the kayaks and ferry everything back. Or what we did was we went on a 3-day backpack trip, walking all the way around those closer in mountains. So that's us having a bivouac under a boulder en route.
What did you do with all the gear, the boxes, the...
Beer cans, plastic.
The beer was in heavy bottles, it never left base camp. We burned some of it, a lot of it got shipped back in the kayaks back to the base camp. So that's why there wasn't really room for all the people in the kayaks going back, so some of us walked back. Polythene bags got burned, not the best thing for the air, but... And then I have to confess, there are small stashes of dried peas all over South Greenland. They were the worst of the dried food that we had. They were like bullets. The only way that you could successfully reconstitute them, we eventually figured out, was 24 hours before you wanted to eat them, you just left them soaking in sugar solution. And then 24 hours later, you tried to cook them as per the instructions.
Right.
And they were almost dead, but yeah, we stashed hordes of those all over the place because we couldn't bear the thought of it anymore.
What kind of food did you have in general?
Um,
Freeze-dried stuff?
Not very much freeze-dried, so
So they
a lot
didn't
of
have
it
that
was
much then.
traditional heavy in those
Right.
boxes. So we had
Right.
canned stews and we had
Right.
jars of jam and
Uh-huh.
cheese.
Right.
So you needed a can opener.
Yes. And a spoon. So the last few days of the expedition, while we were waiting for the boat to pick us up, we all did a variety of sort of local explorations on hills that were interesting but not as hard. So this is one that I went up. That's me again, in case you can't tell. And this is looking inland towards the east.
Is that Anvil Rock behind you?
No, no, that's a different.
Similar.
But yeah, I mean, that actually turned out to be a fairly common shape from whatever the glaciation pattern was. This was although this wasn't a terribly hard mountain, was a wonderful viewpoint. So this is looking down, base camp is behind me. This is the inland end of the lake that we kayaked up. So these mountains in there are where I spent my climbing time. And then if you turn the other 90 degrees to the left, this one is interesting for two reasons. That's the inland ice cap, the southern end of it. So 90% of Greenland is, well, it's probably less now with global warming. Although an interesting thing, I was trying to tell whether global warming had had any effect on these mountains, and you can't tell from the date, of course, on Google Earth, but the Google Earth pictures that I looked at, there was certainly no less snow on those pictures than I remember in 1970. But of course, most of the worries are the actual ice cap. One of you asked me about were there any peaks that we knew about ahead of time?
Yes.
We knew about this peak. It's called Pingasut. Highest, I think, in the region, very difficult. We had thought we might get close to it or climb it. At the event, we didn't even get close, and there's no way we could have climbed it. Nice to see it, though. Keep an eye on that little guy. The rock sticking out of the ice cap wall is called a Nunatak.
Wow.
That's the same Nunatak. So this is, we came off the mountain back to base camp, kayaked up the main fjord for a whole day, just for fun.
And that wall is fairly sheer?
Yes,
Yeah.
so that's sort of like the glacier snouts that you'll see in some of the big Alaskan glaciers. 800 to 1,000 feet is sort of the standard.
Did you see any calving going on?
We did, well, we didn't there, we weren't close enough to. If I ever get invited back here, I have lots of good pictures of calving in Alaska. So partly we came up here because, can you read that? It says St. Andrews University, South Greenland Expedition, 1960. So a previous St. Andrews expedition had come here. They too had thought of climbing Pingasut and failed. The mountains right here were much harder than what we were climbing on. There's another of them. They're very like the Patagonian mountains. You'll love it. So actually, the question about the Inuit language, so some of the this mountain has an Inuit name. It's called Imara, which means perhaps. So we went to explore that for a couple of days. Confessed to being a vandal. So this was our base camp boulder, St. Andrews University South Greenland Expedition 1971. You can tell that it's live because we're getting rid of the excess paraffin before we try and get back on the fishing boat.
What's that?
So, I can answer questions. You can look at some of the show and tell things. That's just arty. So it's a regular ice axe.
Oh, okay.
And then hanging from it are the ice hammer that's on the table
Oh,
there.
okay.
And then carabiner,
Oh, I see.
various pegs and ice
Right.
screws, I
Right,
think.
we couldn't quite make it out. Thank you.
Yeah.
What was the scientific data or whatever that you guys got from this trip?
Well, so, I mean, quite honestly, from our point of view, it was really an exploration mountaineering expedition, but in the report that I brought along, and you're welcome to come and browse at the end, there is a, let's see if I can find what all is in here. There's a botanical report on all the species of plants and locations that we found them.
Any blueberries or similar?
So let me say again.
Blueberries are similar?
Yes, similar, so sort of the small Arctic berries that you get in Alaska, Canada, even Scotland. There was an archaeology report on some of the remains that were found around where our base camp was and further up the fjord. There was a medical report.
Those were Viking remains?
Some of them, I think, they think were older than that. And actually, you'll probably find this interesting.
Did you try or do any fishing?
Like you did, I didn't, but I was rereading my diary in preparation for this, and I did find an entry that said somebody caught some fish. There was a river that flowed out from the inland lake to the fjord right by our base camp. And so my memory says some of them went fishing there. We didn't have a lot of spare time, partly because it was planned as a 10-week climbing expedition, and we spent 3 weeks in the north of it. In retrospect, that was really interesting from this sort of social culture point of view, because we were living in this village. And I mean, I sort of looked at it and thought, this is very similar to all the history I remember from British history and British colonialism. And the thing that struck me was that I was fairly certain that the Danes' intentions were much better than the British government's intentions had ever been. And yet still it didn't seem to be working very well for the native population. The project we were mixing concrete for was an interesting one. They were trying to bring a water line across the harbor, and they were weighing it down with these concrete blocks. And the locals had all told them, as soon as the icebergs come in here in the winter, there goes your water line. But they were building, somebody in Denmark must have been funding it. So it was sort of an interesting experience, but that meant our climbing time was 3 weeks less than we expected, so we actually worked pretty hard.
Do you still stay in contact with the members of the expedition?
So, yeah, and somewhat astonishingly, there were 10 of us. All 10 of us are still alive, which is sort of astounding for a mountaineering group.
Good insurance.
And if you've read any of Bonington's things about, I mean, he has a book, there's a book called Bonington's Boys, and almost everybody they talk about in there is dead. So we had a reunion, maybe it was for our 40th anniversary 5 years ago, and we all got together in a Scottish mountaineering club hut in the Scottish Highlands and spent the weekend and showed these pictures and created a website. And right now, as I speak, we're creating a publish yourself book to give as a present to our leader this summer. So a lot of us are still in touch. Susan and I go stay with my climbing partner every summer that we're in Scotland. But yes, as I look at it, it's truly astonishing that all 10, are, including the leader who was older, are all still alive.
Yeah, usually people who go on these kind of adventures tend to go on other adventures.
I mean, several of my other mountaineering friends from the mountaineering club died in assorted mountain accidents. Not the 10 of it, so maybe we were more careful than some of the others.
Luckier.
Both.
Both, yes.
Thank you.
So hang around and talk if you're interested. Come look at the art